Have you ever had that feeling that someone is watching you? Maybe it's late at night, you're walking through a dimly lit hallway, and even though you tell yourself it's just in your head, every nerve in your body says otherwise. For most of us, that fear fades the moment we close our door and lock it behind us. But for one young woman in Orlando, Florida, that uneasy feeling was not just in her head. It was real, and it cost her everything.
Can you have the complainant step out? We have signal 88 to front window. We have a broken window. There's a weight that was thrown into the window. She doesn't know who. I guess right now all we really have is criminal investigation.
This is the story of Miya Marcano, a 19-year-old college student, a bright soul who is just beginning to build her life. She dreamed of traveling, of pursuing her studies, of becoming someone her family could be proud of. But what she didn't know was that living right across the hall from her was a man whose obsession would spiral into something darker than anyone around her could have imagined. Miya wasn't living in some dangerous neighborhood. She was in what many would consider a safe environment. Arden Villas Apartments, a student housing complex popular among young people in Orlando. She worked in the leasing office, knew her neighbors, and kept a close relationship with her family. By all accounts, she had every reason to feel safe there. But safety, as this story shows us, can sometimes be nothing more than an illusion. Across from Mia's apartment lived Armando Manuel Caballero, a 27-year-old maintenance worker employed by the very complex that was supposed to keep its tenants safe. Armando wasn't just another neighbor passing in the halls. He had taken an unhealthy interest in Miya, one that she repeatedly rejected. Friends would later say she had made it clear she wasn't interested, but rejection didn't stop him. In fact, it seemed to fuel something inside him. Think about that for a moment. Someone with unrestricted access to your living space, someone who has the keys to every door in your building, becoming fixated on you. How safe would you feel then? From the outside, Armando didn't look like the kind of man who would become the villain in a story like this. He was quiet, kept to himself, and wore the mask of someone just doing his job. But beneath that mask was a dangerous obsession, the kind that grows silently until it becomes impossible to ignore. And Miya, unfortunately, was the focus of it. Her friends noticed his persistence. Her coworkers noticed too. But as with so many stories we cover here, warnings were dismissed, red flags overlooked, and on September 24th, 2021, those warnings became reality. September 24th, 2021 started like any other day for Miya. She had classes, responsibilities, and her shift at the leasing office. To her family, she was still the same bubbly daughter who FaceTimed them often. To her coworkers, she was reliable, someone who showed up and got things done. But as the sun began to set that Friday evening, something changed. Miya was supposed to fly home to Fort Lauderdale later that night to visit her family. She had her bags packed, her ticket booked, and she was excited to spend the weekend surrounded by the people she loved most. But when her family went to pick her up from the airport, she wasn't there. No texts, no calls, no updates. It was unlike her, completely out of character. At first, her relatives thought maybe she'd missed her flight or had a delay. But when repeated calls went unanswered, worry began to spread like wildfire. Miya wasn't the type to vanish without a word. By late that night, her family knew something was terribly wrong. They drove straight to her apartment in Orlando, hoping to find her there. Instead, what they found made their worst fears feel all too real. Mia's door was locked, but once they managed to get inside, they saw her belongings scattered, signs of a struggle. Her suitcase was still there, untouched. Her purse, her identification, even her phone. Everything she would have taken on her trip was left behind. And then, there was the blood. Small stains were discovered on her pillow and sheets. To anyone who knew Miya, this wasn't just concerning. It was horrifying. Her family immediately called the police, demanding answers. But here's where the story takes its first frustrating turn. The initial response was slow, almost dismissive. Authorities didn't immediately treat Miya's disappearance as foul play. To them, it was just another case of a young adult possibly taking time away, maybe leaving on her own terms. But Miya's family knew better. They pressed harder, insisting that something sinister had happened inside that apartment. And they were right. Imagine walking into a home where someone you love should be safe, their sanctuary, their private space, and instead, what you find are bloodstains and silence. No note, no clue where they've gone, just that unmistakable sense that something awful has happened. That's exactly what Miya Marcano's family felt on the night of September 24, 2021. But what would follow in the coming hours and days would be a nightmare few families could ever prepare for. When deputies from the Orange County Sheriff's Office first responded to the call, they didn't immediately treat the scene with the urgency Miya's family expected. To them, she was a 19-year-old college student. Maybe she'd left with friends. Maybe she'd gone off on her own. After all, missing adult cases don't always get priority unless there's immediate proof of danger. But that's where the cracks in the system become painfully clear. Because Miya's family knew something was wrong, even if the initial officers didn't. Think about it. Her phone, her wallet, her flight plans, all abandoned. If you were leaving voluntarily, would you leave behind the very things that connected you to your world? Her suitcase, still packed, sat waiting in her room. The evidence screamed that she hadn't gone anywhere willingly. But it would take hours, crucial, irreplaceable hours, before the case was escalated. As detectives started to canvass the apartment complex, their attention quickly shifted to someone who had both access and motive: Armando Manuel Caballero, the 27-year-old maintenance worker. And here's where the case takes its first chilling twist. Armando wasn't some random figure in Miya's life. He lived across the hall. He had keys to her apartment. And Miya had already told friends and family that he made her uncomfortable. He had asked her out repeatedly. She had rejected him, firmly, clearly, without hesitation. But as anyone familiar with stalking cases knows, rejection doesn't always end in obsession. In fact, it often makes it worse. Investigators soon learned that earlier that same day, the day Miya vanished, Armando had used his master key to enter her apartment. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And he didn't clock in for a routine maintenance call. He went in without permission. He went in because he wanted access to Miya. Now let's pause for a second. A master key, one key that opens every door in the complex. It's meant to be a tool of safety and convenience for maintenance staff. But in the wrong hands, it's a weapon. Imagine knowing that someone obsessed with you has the ability to walk into your bedroom, into your most private space, without needing to break a lock or force entry. How safe would you feel? The digital records in Arden Villa's apartments left no doubt. Armando had entered Miya's apartment around 4:30 p.m., just before she was supposed to finish her shift at the leasing office. From that moment on, her fate was sealed. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. Despite this damning evidence, Armando was still free to move around in the hours after Miya went missing. Deputies questioned him, yes. They asked where he had been, what he had done. He denied any involvement, insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. And because they didn't yet have enough to arrest him, they let him go.
Meanwhile, Miya's family wasn't sitting around waiting for answers. They mobilized instantly. Her father, stepmother, and cousins flooded the complex, demanding action. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, posted flyers, and pleaded with the public for information. To them, every second mattered. But the longer the search dragged on, the more unbearable the silence became. And then Armando started to act strange. Witnesses would later recall how he appeared nervous, fidgety, and inconsistent in his stories. He had scratches on his arms that he couldn't explain. His phone record showed suspicious activity. And while the sheriff's office tried to maintain the line that they had no suspect, everyone watching the case knew exactly who their eyes were on. Still, the question remained. Where was Miya? For nearly a week, the search consumed Orlando. Volunteers joined Miya's family, scouring wooded areas, lakes, and remote stretches of land near the complex. Social media campaigns spread her photo everywhere. Her name trended nationally. Celebrities and influencers amplified the call to find Miya. It felt like the entire state of Florida was looking for her. And yet, every night ended with the same crushing disappointment. No sign of Miya. The longer she remained missing, the darker the possibilities became. Statistically, investigators knew the truth. In cases of abduction by someone known to the victim, the first 24 to 48 hours are critical. Beyond that, the chances of finding the victim alive plummet. Miya's family refused to give up hope, but behind the scenes, detectives were already preparing for the worst. And then came another devastating twist. On September 27th, just 3 days after Miya vanished, deputies discovered the body of Armando Caballero inside a garage in Seminole County. The cause of death? Suicide by hanging. It was as if the prime suspect in Miya's disappearance had written the final chapter of his story before investigators could force him to speak. His death didn't just rob the Marcano family of answers, it robbed them of justice. Because now, even if evidence tied him directly to Miya's fate, he would never stand trial, never face their questions, never be held accountable in a court of law. But Armando's death wasn't the end. If anything, it was another cruel clue. Because now investigators knew, beyond doubt, that he was the one responsible. The problem was, he had taken his secrets with him. And Miya was still missing. With Armando dead, investigators were left with fragments, pieces of a puzzle that suddenly had no narrator. But even in his silence, the evidence began to speak. Detectives combed through his digital footprint, pulling cell phone records, GPS data, and surveillance footage. And what they discovered painted a picture more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Armando's phone placed him at multiple suspicious locations on the very night Miya vanished. He wasn't just in and out of her apartment complex. He traveled to isolated wooded areas, back roads, and abandoned fields. Why? To detectives, it was obvious. He was looking for a place to hide what he had done. This pattern, abduction followed by disposal in a secluded area, is tragically common in cases involving stalkers and intimate obsession. The control doesn't stop with the victim's death. It extends to the final act of deciding where and how that victim will be hidden. It's about power. And Armando, who had been rejected, stripped of control, and obsessed with Miya, made sure his last act was one of total domination. But the search for Miya wasn't just about maps and cell towers. It was about people, her family, her friends, her community. Day after day they gathered, holding vigils and rallies. They wore shirts with her face, carried signs, and demanded answers. Imagine being her mother or father, looking out at hundreds of strangers, all chanting her daughter's name, all begging for her safe return. That mixture of hope and despair is almost unbearable to think about. And yet, what makes this case even more gut-wrenching is the series of failures that allowed it to happen in the first place. Armando should never have had the access he did. Ardenvilla's apartments didn't have strong policies in place to protect residents from maintenance workers misusing master keys. Background checks, oversight, accountability, all were either weak or non-existent. This wasn't just about one man's obsession, it was about a system that allowed that obsession to thrive unchecked. Now here's why I want you to really pause and put yourself in Miya's shoes. Imagine living in a complex where someone you've rejected, someone who gives you that gut-level feeling of unease, has the power to open your door whenever they want. Imagine reporting that discomfort, telling others about it, and still nothing changes. This is the nightmare that women all over the world face. Miya's case isn't isolated. It's part of a much larger, darker pattern.
As the search stretched into its fourth, fifth, and sixth day, public pressure mounted. The media camped outside the complex. Reporters followed every development, asking why police hadn't found Miya, why Armando hadn't been stopped sooner, why the apartment complex wasn't being held accountable. And yet every answer seemed incomplete. It was as if the truth was always just beyond reach. Then came October 2, 2021, 8 days after Miya was last seen. Deputies, following the digital trail of Armando's movements, searched an area near the Timberscan apartments, about 20 miles from where Miya lived. There, hidden in a wooded patch near a dilapidated building, they found what everyone had been dreading: human remains. The location wasn't random. It was a place Armando's phone had pinged in the hours after Miya disappeared. Detectives later confirmed what her family already knew in their hearts. It was Miya. She had been bound with duct tape, her body concealed in brush, left alone in the Florida heat. The discovery was both a relief and a devastation. Relief because her family finally had answers, no more endless nights of wondering. Devastation because those answers confirmed their worst fears. Miya was gone, and the man responsible had already taken the coward's way out, leaving them with grief but no justice. But let's look deeper, because this is where the story shifts from tragedy into something larger. Miya's death exposed the terrifying reality of stalking behaviors and the gaps in the systems meant to protect us. Studies show that nearly 76% of women murdered by intimate partners were stalked before their deaths. 76%. Think about that. Miya had told people she felt uncomfortable. She had been clear about Armando's unwanted advances. Yet, because there were no structures in place to take her seriously or to prevent him from abusing his access, her warnings became prophecy. Her case forced Florida lawmakers to confront these failures head-on. In the months that followed, legislation known as Miya's Law was introduced, demanding stricter background checks for apartment employees and tighter controls over master keys. It was a step toward accountability, but for Miya's family, it would never be enough. No law could bring her back. And here's something else worth noting. Armando wasn't a man with no history. He had a record of disturbing behavior, including a past arrest for burglary. Yet he was still employed in a role that gave him total access to tenants' lives. The lack of thorough vetting wasn't just negligence, it was complicity. How many warning signs have to be ignored before someone finally listens?
Even more chilling was the revelation that Armando had expressed his obsession openly. He had told co-workers he liked Miya, admitted to pursuing her despite her rejections. His fixation wasn't a secret. But in our society, we often downplay men's persistence as harmless or even romantic. We frame rejection as something to be overcome, not respected. That cultural mindset is what allows predators like Armando to hide in plain sight. For Miya's family, every unanswered call from police, every shrug from apartment management, every day without answers felt like salt in an open wound. They didn't just lose their daughter, they lost faith in the systems that were supposed to protect her. And maybe that's the scariest part of this story, the realization that danger doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from the neighbor across the hall, wearing a uniform, holding the keys to your life. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The hope that Miya would be found alive began to fade, though her family never stopped searching. Flyers covered walls, friends and strangers joined in search parties, and social media flooded with her picture. Orlando was no longer just a city going about its normal business. It became the center of a desperate mission: bring Miya home. But Armando Caballero was no longer around to answer questions. On September 27th, just 3 days after Miya went missing, authorities found him dead in what was ruled a suicide. It was a moment that stunned investigators and family alike. The one man who had been the focus of suspicion, the man Miya had feared, was gone, taking with him any chance of interrogation, any chance of direct answers. His silence only deepened the mystery, leaving behind more questions than clarity. Still, investigators pressed on.
With Armando gone, the search for Miya became even more urgent. Cell phone data, key fob records, and surveillance footage painted a grim picture. They discovered that Armando had used his master key fob to access Miya's apartment shortly before her disappearance. He had entered her space uninvited, violating the very idea of home as a place of safety. What investigators uncovered was a pattern. The same key had been used by him in multiple instances. That master key, meant only for maintenance and emergencies, had become a weapon in his hands. On October 2nd, 8 agonizing days after she vanished, the truth came crashing down. Searchers discovered a body in a wooded area near Timberscon-on-the-Lake apartments in Orlando. It was Miya. She had been bound with duct tape, her wrists and ankles restrained, her mouth covered. The very details confirmed the horror her family had feared but prayed against. Her bright life had been extinguished in a brutal and senseless act of violence. The news shattered her family. Her father, her mother, her siblings, they had clung to hope, but hope was gone. The community mourned alongside them, gathering in vigils, holding candles against the darkness, refusing to let Miya's name fade into silence. Her story spread far beyond Florida. Across the nation, people saw her face and asked the same haunting question: how could this have happened? The investigation revealed what Miya already knew in life. Armando's obsession was no secret. She had rejected him. She had told others he made her uncomfortable. And yet nothing had stopped him. Nothing had prevented him from using his access, his position, his keys to shatter the life of a young woman who should have been safe in her own home. Her case sparked outrage, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed: a glaring failure in the systems meant to protect tenants. How could a maintenance worker hold that kind of unchecked access? How could complaints of harassment be so easily dismissed? How many red flags had been ignored, brushed aside, or underestimated? From that outrage came something lasting. Lawmakers in Florida introduced what is now known as Miya's Law. It requires stronger protections for tenants, including background checks for apartment staff, stricter protocols for access to units, and to push for accountability from landlords and property managers. The law became a way of ensuring that Miya's name would not just be tied to tragedy, but also to change. But for her family, no law could replace the daughter they lost. They have spoken often of her smile, her laughter, her dreams. They have carried the weight of her absence into every day since. Each holiday, each birthday, each quiet moment reminds them of what was stolen. For them, Miya's story is not just one of legislative reform. It is personal. It is grief carved into their lives forever. And for the rest of us, Miya's story lingers because it is so frighteningly ordinary. She was not walking alone in a dark alley. She was not engaging in risky behavior. She was simply living, studying, working, existing in spaces that should have been safe. Her killer was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, but a man with a uniform, a job title, and a key. That is what makes this story a dark pattern, a system that failed to see the danger until it was too late, a predator who hid in plain sight, and a young woman caught in the crosshairs of obsession and control. So as we close this story, ask yourself, how often do we ignore those quiet red flags? How often do we brush off the uncomfortable moments, the uneasy glances, the boundaries crossed? Miya's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself with violence from the start. Sometimes it begins with something as small as not respecting the word no. In the end, Miya Marcano's life is remembered not only for how it ended, but for the light she carried while she was here. Her story is one of potential, of love, of family, and of dreams cut short. But it is also a warning, a reminder that behind the most ordinary patterns of life, darkness can sometimes hide waiting for the moment to break through. And that is why we tell these stories here on Dark Patterns, not just to recount tragedy, but to recognize the deeper truths they reveal. Miya's story is not only about loss, it is about vigilance, about the need for systems to change, and about the importance of never ignoring the shadows when they creep too close, because sometimes seeing the pattern is the only way to break it.